it's a 200-pound rule of thumb. So if a 200-pound man can stand, or woman, stand out in the sediment and it generally holds them up, then probably it can hold a sill. It definitely can help hold a core log or sand. Also good to know for constructability. So if you are running into a sediment like we do in Norfolk often, that is so soupy, it's going to take a lot of sand to solidify that. So probably not great to put your construction equipment in there. It's going to also change the way you're going to order your materials. So if you are trying to get an elevation of a foot, that muck is going to probably take a lot of that foot of elevation. You're going to have to add a lot more sand than you actually expect. What is the fetch? So a fetch is basically the amount of time that wave and wind energy has to travel over water as it hits the shoreline. And this is one of the main factors that the Virginia Institute of Marine Science uses right now as in their suitability matrix for living shorelines. They have it broken down that a low fetch is 0 to a half a mile, moderate is between a half and 2, and high is greater than 2 miles. And even if you have fetch greater than 2 miles, you can do a living shoreline. It's just going to change the way you're going to construct your sill and how big that gray element of your project is actually going to be. Orientation. So north-facing shorelines are going to receive the least amount of sun. This is going to be particularly true if you have any type of elements that are shading the shoreline. So if you have a large buffer, you're going to be, or even some type of structure on the shoreline that's giving it more shade, you're going to be fighting that shade. It also provides north and northeast. Our facing projects are going to receive the highest wind events from those nor'easters. So you are going to have to start designing for those larger wave action and flood environments. So what is the bank height and bank conditions? So this is not a situation we see in the Elizabeth River. This is actually that I permitted in Surrey County. Luckily, I didn't have to design a fix for this one. But it's just to show that you really need to understand what's going on the bank. Can it be, if you're in the Elizabeth, can you just grade bank back a little bit and put a shoreline in front of it? Is the bank stabilized, and how do you stabilize it? In this picture, you can see that there is a structure directly next to that eroding bank. So even if they wanted to do something for some type of back rating, they wouldn't be able to because of the structure. And in this case, they actually had a septic system right behind this as well. All things to pay attention to in your designs. What is the near shore depth? So again, this is why those NOAA charts are important. This is a project that you see a picture of in the city of Norfolk with a new channel directly adjacent to this, what was an existing bulkhead. So although the project itself was probably a great candidate for a typical living shoreline, that new channel was so close to that bulkhead that there was no way that you could fill out into the water and back grade back. So this particular designer actually designed a kind of a knee height. So this wall is about a little over 2 feet and is acting as a sill. So it's holding back that back grading and that upland planting. And so you have this kind of hybrid living shoreline concept here, where at high tide, this wall gets flooded, or it floods over the wall and goes into that Spartina patens that was planted there. It's also important to remember that deep water directly adjacent to an upland is the highest environment for erosion. The goal is to try and get deep water that transitions to shallow water and non-vegetated wetlands that then shallows or then transfers to vegetated wetlands. And what are your jurisdictions? So there's actually another session just about jurisdictional determinations and things of that sort, but it's always important to remember which type of regulator and who is going to be looking at your project. And if you impact one regulatory section, are they going to let you work in the other? So in the city of Portsmouth, I have a project going on right now with a living shoreline, and our access is through the buffer. And we've had to work with the CBPA manager there to come up with an access plan that is appropriate through the CBPA in order to access our wetlands for our restoration. So all localities are going to look at that a little different. I would recommend to anybody to build a relationship with your local regulators, because they're going to give you a lot of tips, and they're going to look more favorably on your projects if you ask them questions, have them out on site ahead of time to just have them take a look and tell you what they see. So this project, which looked like an obvious project to the designer at the time, just wanted to rebuild the bulkhead. But when they showed up, the regulator noticed that, oh, there's actually jurisdictional wetlands that were being mowed behind the bulkhead. So he had already done all the work to do the design, to redo the bulkhead, and the regulator got out there and said, sorry, you know, that falls within the Wetlands Board jurisdiction. We need to talk about living shorelines now. So using those, the small fetch to moderate to larger fetch, that's when you start deciding which type of living shoreline is appropriate at your location. If you have no fetch and you're in a really well protected cove, maybe just some sand fill to get the elevation that those plants really like, and some grading of that buffer, and some planting is all you need. And probably most likely dealing with some of those stormwater problems on the upland. If you've got still a fairly low fetch, which is kind of our bread and butter here in the Elizabeth River project so far, is core logs, which will degrade after 2 to 3 years, just amount of time for hopefully that living shoreline to take place and stabilize itself, or oyster bags. We're trying to figure out some oyster bags that actually aren't made of plastic and dissolve. We tried that last year, and unfortunately they dissolved within 2 weeks. And so the oyster bags are gone. We just had a pile of oysters. So we're working with that. And then you get to your larger fetch, where you actually start working with things like rock, oyster castles, or breakwaters. And I'll turn this over to Joe to give a little bit of tips of what we've learned from some of these structures. You're muted, Joe.
Do you want to stop sharing your screen and I'll add mine?
Absolutely.
Thanks. All right. Can everyone see my screen? Rachel, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the materials that Rachel just talked about, and also logistics for getting these materials to the site, because access is always a key element you need to be looking at when you're designing your living shoreline. So starting out with kind of the soft approach, core logs are typically the our typical materials that we use. They the key thing here is make sure you order the high density core logs versus the low density core logs. They come in these different densities, and if you can pick it up with 1 or 2 people, that's a low density core log. If it takes more than 3 people, that is a high density core log. And here you can see they come in 10 and 12 foot sections, and the diameter, which gives you kind of that sand lift, is anywhere from 12 to, you can get them in 12-inch diameters and 16-inch diameters. So the core logs, they typically are you carry them with multiple folks with these strings that you see here. So actually Pam Boatwright on our staff developed this method. It works really well moving them as a group. Something to also know, it took us a little bit of time to learn this, is that they float, which is great, so that if you have to move them down a shoreline, you can float a bunch of them without carrying them down the shoreline very easily. However, if you float them, you will not be able to pick them up to get them above. If you have to go above into a dry area, they're almost impossible to move. But they do work well floating. And then once they get floated into positions, here you can see we use 5-foot oak stakes where we make a kind of a teepee and it pins the log down. We'll put about four of those pairs in and then tie them down. And then that will, the reason for that is just in case the string that you tie them down with break loose, at least you have them pinned down. And usually after a couple tidal cycles, they'll actually become waterlogged and they won't move around too much. Now, one thing to note is access. So when you order them, they will typically do not take them off of the tractor trailer. So make sure you have lots of volunteers and that you have a number of people that you would need to move them along with the oak stakes. We typically buy these from ACF, which is a company here in Chesapeake. They get the materials in, they have the high density core logs and 12-foot sections. They are very responsive. That's the other thing, is that a lot of these companies that have these materials, it can be fairly difficult to get. So that's just another logistic where we know that this is a company that we can get these materials. But the key here is have a plan for when it shows up on site, because they will not unload it for you. And then moving to the next kind of the next softer element would be these oyster bags. So here you see Jim Cahoon putting in a project for James River Association here, where the oyster bags are placed in front of the core log. And one thing that we've typically not dabbled with these oyster bags because of they're made out of plastic. And we've all read what microplastics are doing to our water. So we've been trying to come up with alternatives. And here you see these biodegradable bags that we recently used this past summer. We actually got 2 months out of them. So over on your left, you can see they're stacked against the core logs. And then this is what's left after 2 months. So the nice thing is that this allows them to at least one, you can get them to the oysters to the site fairly easily. You can stack them really easily, and the shell is staying in place at this site. So we're still working with Filtrex is the company that made these bags, and we were doing a demo for them. But we'll probably continue to use these just to get shell on site, because we're trying to restore not only just wetlands, but also oyster habitat. So you want to try to restore that continuum from oyster to wetland and then upland buffer. Oyster Castles. So Oyster Castles are a product that, again, are readily available. They're about $6 a block delivered. You can get around 1,000 blocks on a tractor trailer. When they show up, you can request that they have a forklift, so you can actually place them where you want. And this forklift can actually get right up to the shoreline without doing damage to yards, which is important. Just a note, yard damage is probably our hardest fix on projects. So when you're all done with the project, you feel real good, and then the homeowner is not happy about the damage to the yard. So that is something to definitely keep in mind when you're doing these projects. But we then actually lay the design out on land before we do it in water, which is important because there's different designs that you can use. This one that you see here on the right, this is what we call diamond face. And the diamond face, basically, we typically use this because basically the points of the oyster castle are pointing channelward and also landward. And the reason this is important is because when the wave hits this structure, it doesn't propagate the wave down a flat structure. So you can arrange, a lot of the designs that you'll see actually create more of a wall element with oyster castles where it's the flat part is facing the channel. Well, that can propagate the wave action down and actually cause issues in other areas of the marsh. So this actually helps to dissipate that. And then the way we get them down is we usually use the bucket method. So line up a bunch of volunteers, we hand them down, and then usually it's important that you just have one person who's placing. And I know that sounds a little bit crazy when you're trying to do a sill structure like this. However, it's important because that person keeps the structure straight. And if you get off just a little bit with this, it's a mess. So we typically have a single person placing with volunteers handing down the materials. And then you have rock sill structures. So then this is where you get, so everything I've mentioned thus far can be done with volunteers. It actually typically is more cost effective for homeowners. When you start getting into machinery and rocks, that's where you start seeing an increase in price. And I can tell you the number one issue we always have with homeowners is, the first question is how much it's going to cost. So though these structures can resist more wave action, it is important to know that they are more costly. And then sand fill is also an important element. We have been going to coarser material because we don't lose as much material off of a site. And so we have been using Vulcan white sand for probably the last year, and I'd like to thank Seamus for making that recommendation. We typically don't lose as much material, but it is more costly. And I think we're going back to you, Rachel. Is that right?
Yeah. Okay, and I will just bounce back and forth. If you want to.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry. So to me, the biggest thing anyone can learn, or the most important thing to learn, which is going to change the way that you design your project, is where plants like to grow. So in the tidal environment, plants in the tidal saline environment, plants like to grow based off of how often their feet get wet. And although I'm not particularly a plant person, which is nice for me because we just have to know about 6 different plants and we can get our design rolling. It's important to know Spartina alterniflora is going to be your low marsh species, and it likes to grow at mean tide. So, and no lower than mean tide. The best thing to do is take a look at where Spartina alterniflora is growing in surrounding properties, and use that as your lowest elevation that you're trying to hit, so the minimum elevation. If you are trying to account for sea level rise, find the highest point that Spartina alterniflora is growing in the area and try and hit that elevation. So that will allow a little bit of sea level rise to still move in and allow the Spartina to stay. So that would be somewhere between mean tide and mean high. And then once you get past mean high, that's where Peyton's likes to live. So Peyton's will actually grow outside of or above the wetlands board jurisdiction in sandy substrates, and is a fairly strong species for planting. So once you hit that mean high, you're going to transfer to your Spartina Peyton's. You could also put in some Disticula spicata and a few other fun species that don't mind getting their feet wet, but maybe not as much as alterniflora. In some of your lower tidal saline areas, Spartina sinusoides will grow between mean high and upper limits. We haven't tried anything with sinusoides yet. I hear that it's hard to grow and sometimes hard to source, but it's something that I want to start incorporating into some of our Chesapeake and upper reach areas. It's also something that will compete against Phragmites if you can get it going well. So we're going to try that. And then the other that I want to try and incorporate is more Juncus. So Juncus grows above mean high water, and you usually in natural environments will see it kind of in these like higher elevation islands. So that again is something that you want to incorporate in your high species. And then Iva frutescens is going to be super happy at the top of the wetlands board jurisdiction, so 1.5 times, and then Bacchus is usually just above that. It's important to know these things, and we'll talk about it with the next project Joe's going to talk about. But if you are planning to do a living shoreline that transitions into a buffer, and you accidentally put your buffer just a little bit too low, which I've seen in a few projects in Norfolk and a few locality projects, and even in an ERP project, you put all of these non-wetland species into an area that get too wet too often. And especially in Norfolk, when you have a shallow slope, that upper limit of wetlands is probably more landward than you actually think it's going to be. So it's important to really pay attention to where those flood tides are going so that you put those wetland species in that area and put those buffer plants behind them. As most everybody knows, April through June is the best time to plant. Although last year we did a number of living shorelines in the fall and those plants are happy. Plant grasses generally around 18-inch centers. And then you want to place those plugs at least 6 inches down. And then goose protection is key. As soon as you plant, protect those plants from those geese. And Joe, if you want, I'll just keep this up and you can talk about it.
Yeah, just keep it up. Just keep it up. That's fine. So I wanted to talk briefly about a project that we work with the city of Norfolk on, and also a homeowner. So it was on city property, but we had to get access through a homeowner's property in order to do the project. So this is at the mouth of Nitty Mill Creek on 52nd Street in Norfolk. We had built a reef in 2014 with Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And here you can see on the right-hand side, back then, we still had some Spartina alterniflora growing at the site, but as we kept visiting the reef, we continued to see the marsh getting eroded away. Next slide, Rachel. So this was the existing conditions about a year and a half ago, where we saw significant amounts of erosion going on, as you can see on the left and also on the right. And then this is the reef that was in front of the marsh. And so what we started thinking is maybe we can, at the same time, protect this peninsula, but while also incorporating oyster habitat into the design. Next slide. So this is the project here. If you look over on the left side, you see Nitty Mill Creek. And there's a part of this project that is north facing, and as Rachel mentioned, we had about over 1.5 miles of fetch, and not so much shading issues, but the fetch really was impacting the shoreline. And then if you look on down here on the right-hand side, you see another little white area that we were going to restore. It's 40 linear feet. This area was being impacted actually by boat wakes. So what would happen is this is in a no wake zone, but the funny thing is when boats come flying through here, they end up slowing down right at the no wake area, which starts right near the end of that peninsula, and it would throw a giant wave onto the shoreline. And so we had both wave action from boats and wave action from north facing shoreline. So what we propose to do is to use Oyster Castles stacked 3 high. When you stack them 3 high, you get about a 20-inch lift. So it allows you to bring the site up about 20 inches. Next slide.
Oh, sorry.
We went in for design. Now, let me just say, this was designed by myself. Rachael has gotten much more sophisticated in her designs. So this is typically what you need for a cross section, typical cross section for your permit, where we showed the existing reef, the proposed Oyster Castles stacked 3 high with geotextile fabric underneath it, wrapped up on the landward side. Then we would backfill with sand that you see here, put our goose fencing in, and then stop the ongoing erosion, and then match up with the current marsh, which was behind the eroding marsh behind the project. Next slide. So here you can kind of see we had the Oyster Castles dropped off in this residence yard. On the right, you can see we did a demonstration of how we were going to install them, so everyone was aware. You see the geofabric laid down in front of the shoreline. And then we have volunteers handing the castles down to the person placing them. Next slide. So here you can see the sill created on the left-hand side with the volunteers. And then on the right-hand side at one end, we used another product, which is, we call them Oyster Bags, made by a person here in town, Michael Berg. So we demonstrated two different ones. And then here you can, so that was after it was, the sand was placed and also the castles. And this is what it looks like in the first growing year. Usually we see it takes about 2 years to really get it filled in, but we were really happy to see that the grasses came in, they're doing healthy. Behind it, you can see we had black needle rush, which we've stopped the ongoing erosion. And then we also met the secondary habitat goal of providing some oyster habitat. And you can see it in the bottom that these oyster castles do real well with recruiting oysters. And they basically cement these castles together. So even though this site sees pretty significant wave action, this design holds up very well. It was low cost. We did this project less than $6,000. We were able to involve volunteers that people really enjoy getting out pre-COVID, obviously, to take part in this. And at the same time, we were able to add back to the oyster habitat at the site. Next slide. I'm going to turn it back over to Rachael.
All right. So here's a design that we're working on for an install this spring that is currently finishing up with our permitting. So I just wanted to show it because it kind of incorporates pretty much everything that Joe talked about into one project. So this is private property on the Western Branch Elizabeth River in Portsmouth. And you can see here there's kind of a number of situations as far as erosion is concerned. So on the left side of the screen, you can tell that there's erosion, but you don't have a high escarpment, and it's also fairly protected. Let's see, I may have skipped one. Let's see. Okay, so you can see here. So it's fairly protected over here, and then on this side you have about 0.75 miles of fetch, and also a little bit more boat wake. So as a result, we kind of split this up into 3 concepts where we have one, it's easier access right here because we can come right through the property, which means sand fill is going to be a lot easier by wheelbarrow. So we are going to do a installation of a core log sill with backfill and planting, and in front of the sill, oyster shell. And ERP is starting to use oyster shell channel word of almost all core log projects, because sometimes those core logs go and there needs to just be a little bit of that toe protection where that core log once was. And we're finding that even just a shallow layer of oyster shells can provide that little bit of toe protection that's needed. So when we come over on the other side of the pier and move into this higher wave energy area, in the area that's easier to access, we're going to do a typical oyster castle with backfill of sand. But you can see the access here is really tough. It's all a Phragmites marsh. So in the areas that are tougher to access, we're just going to abut the oyster castles directly adjacent to that Phragmites marsh. And the goal of that will just be to slow down erosion. So we won't be actually doing any wetlands restoration at that point, but hopefully slow that erosion down enough to catch some sediment over time and at least keep it where it's at. And I just wanted to show you the cross sections of those concepts. So over here where we have the core logs, we have our sand fill area with our 18-inch core logs. So core logs come in 12 and 18 inches. I'm finding I like to design with 18 inches because when you get settling, or you feel, or maybe you just mismeasured on site and you need a little bit more than a foot lift, that 18 inches will give you enough to fill that sand behind it. And then we permitted that oyster shell toe in front. So this shows loose shell, but we could also do oyster bags or something of that sort. A quick note, we've also talked about doing, I saw Chris's comment about not liking oyster bags. I agree that if you are stacking those oyster bags, there is a bunch of really important resource in there that's not actually functioning anymore. So we've actually discussed in some places, instead of using oyster shell, can we do a tiny rock toe? So far, the regulators have been a little bit uncomfortable with designing a rock toe that isn't a sill, and I haven't made it very far in that discussion. So I'm gonna hopefully I'll catch a regulator that will let us try, and we can try a small rock sill in lieu of oyster shell in those places where maybe spat set isn't going to be great. And then here we have just the Oyster Castle stack directly abutted to an existing marsh. And then we have our Oyster Castle stack with sandfill behind it and planting. All of this sandfill is going to be low marsh, so we're proposing Spartina alterniflora. And then just a picture of what that diamond stack looks like. And really, that is the conclusion there. I'm excited to have some conversations because I see that chat is going off. If you want more additional information on some of the specifics for siting and designing, Walter Priest wrote this really great paper called Practical Living Shorelines Tailored to Fit in the Chesapeake Bay. And it's really the perfect guide for getting you started. But as Joe tells me often, the best way to learn it is just to do it and just try it. So at that, I'm happy to answer any questions, or we can go through the chat. Anything
Rachel, I was going to say maybe we hit some of these chat questions. And
yeah.
So Chris, I saw the question about the leading edge with erosion at the Oyster Castles. That's a good point. Yes, actually one side, the boat wake side of that project, we are seeing undercutting, and we anticipate on putting some of those shell bags there. The interesting thing on the other side where we get the fetch, we're not seeing that going on in that area. So something that Rachael has been doing is adding that toe protection in at the end on our projects has seemed to stop that issue. So that is something that we're seeing. And then the other question you had is the cost. So the cost of this project, the project I covered, 3 high on a linear foot basis with sand and everything, was about $35 a linear foot. But that also used volunteer labor too. So it's kind of hard to calculate labor time and install since we had volunteers helping.
Hold on, Joe. Just to give a perspective, since COVID, we haven't had volunteers. So we've been just hiring contractors to do those installs. We did 170 linear feet of just core log with 9 feet of sandfill, and without being charged for our design time or our time to manage the project came out to be about $17,000. So $17,000 for 170 linear feet of core log and sandfill.
And that's about $100 a linear foot. So the volunteers really provide that cost savings to the homeowner.
This is City Gasco. I can give you some costs with rock seal design since we do have a project going on right now over at Linwood, behind Linwood Elementary in Broad Park. That is, of course, that's a beefier rock seal design, and the contracted cost came out to I think that's $300 a linear foot for sill. That's rock. And of course, that is also wrapped up in a multi-line bid project. So they could find ways to make one thing cost a lot more than others. And then I can look back at our other projects that we had done 2 years ago that are rock seal. Another contractor, same designer, same design, but different contractor, put in at $200 per linear foot for the rock seal alone. So there's some different ways of costs that are done by contractor depending on how they operate, where they're located, where the materials are located, because obviously rock is not a natural material for this area, so that's getting trucked in from from Richmond. So you have those trucking costs that definitely come into play for those materials. So the better if you can get away from rock and have those sills that are core logs the lower your costs will be for trucking and for just raw materials alone. And also, you can think of it another beneficial way is you're reducing your carbon footprint of the cost of your project if you have less trucking going on. A lot of people don't put that into their overall costs or benefit, but you can think of it that way as well.
So CW, just to add to that, the cost I gave, the 35, that was total project cost, so not just the sill structure. And then, I think that as you guys know, those two different contractor costs that you just mentioned, you guys would probably, those were two different caliber of contractors, and so I think that when you pay for the gold, the gold standard, it's going to get done perfectly, and you're not going to have issues versus other contractors who may come in a little bit lower. You may have, we've seen that before, right? I mean, it's just how bids can turn out.
Oh yeah, and say if you're a private owner, you're a private property owner, you don't have to go to the lowest bid if you want to. And that's how it is though with everything. You get what you pay for, and with government contracts, you always have to go. Usually, there's very rare circumstances that allow you to go outside the lowest bid, and so that's sometimes you do get what you pay for. But I just want to let other people know if they have big projects that they're thinking about heading out with large rock sill, then that will be the case. But we haven't seen some of those projects also had core logs in them, and those are coming in around $60 a linear foot for installation of the core logs of those high density 16, 18-inch core logs. And that's what we're seeing for those costs using contractors in the Middle Atlantic area.
Right. So we got only a couple seconds. Brian asked what happened to the core logs when they're gone. So they actually biodegrade, and then the shell that Rachael mentioned helps to protect the marsh and elevation. Let's see. Volunteer training. Yes, we do volunteer training prior, and they sign waivers of liability before participating. And we also have to make sure the homeowners are okay with volunteers being on their site.
How much was that core log cost again?
It's $100 core log for a 12-foot core log, and that's 12 inches in diameter. And I think the 16-inch diameter, you jump up to like $125 a core log. And you can call. I gotcha.